So thanks, Gail, for this somewhat realistic introduction of my somewhat non-linear journey that has led me to here. But as you'll maybe find out in my presentation then, it sounds as if I'm really going through, life like this. And as I sometimes say in casual conversation, by the time I retire, I'll be in music. And actually, there's a chance. There's a chance, and I'll ask you later why. Okay? So I was told that you're just basically interested in, what one can do, what individuals with a bit of university training can do, which may also not be completely standard. And you're also interested in sort of fun results and wow results. I don't know whether I can do that. But, I can show you what I'm doing and you decide whether it's interesting or maybe not. But then, Gail also told me that I should be a little bit sort of personal in the sense showing how I personally slithered into what I'm doing. And then I have a couple of questions more at the end about suggestions that were what was an interesting moment in my career, etc., etc. And you can actually do these questions yourself once we get there. But to give the whole thing a little bit of structure, I wanted to start to tell you about the area of my research. And you can see it already, and I advise you to look at this slide, of course. The question and the area of research that is going on now in my lab, which I call Action Lab, just to, to give a bit of oomph to students when they sort of dribble on, is control and coordination of human movements. Or, how does the brain control our movements? Right? So, many, and probably most of you, don't appreciate what we're doing all the time. What you're currently doing, and this is looking at me, holding your head upright, or maybe doing a lot of work in keeping your chin up, okay, looking with your eyes left to right, and basically not kind of just disappearing in your chair and slithering down, which is what would happen if your muscles and your brain and your nervous system wouldn't do anything. So the fact that I'm standing, walking here, talking, gesturing, moving my head and giving some force to my voice, this is all the work of incredibly coordinated, challenging work of my muscles that are under the control of my brain. So how on earth do we do that? So let's sort of step back a little bit and just look at some fun activities where many of us as in my colleagues, have entered that field of what is sometimes called movement neuroscience or motor control or something of that sort. There's lots of different names to it. Let's call it movement neuroscience for the time being. So there is a bunch of interesting activities. So how are you doing? What is top left? Oh, okay, we're fine. Okay, so I mean, it's very easy and straightforward to say, wow, this guy is good, okay? And there is a 5-club juggler. Ah, that's good, very good. There's a 5-club juggler, and you don't do this overnight. How many of you juggle? Oh, okay, very good, very good. So there is some crazy guy at the top, at the bottom here. Free climbing. Anybody's doing this? Thank God. This is dangerous stuff. No, that's not it. Okay. There is the bottom left. There is some dancing, okay? And dancing is also quite challenging to some, more than others. And actually, sort of a little bit of background, I was always into dancing. So whenever I could go dance, it doesn't matter what, as long as there was music and there was opportunity to dance, I was there until the light went out. So my interest started with sort of asking, so why do I like it? What do I do? And why can't my boyfriends? I always pick the wrong one. to move to music in a coordinated fashion? How do you time your movement appropriately, let alone aesthetically? I wouldn't even go there. I was already satisfied if they kept the rhythms, my boyfriends. So that was a perennial question. So how do we dance? How do we step rhythmically? How do we synchronize our bodily movement to an external rhythm or to another person who has potentially a not that irregular rhythm? So how does our brain pick up via perceptual sensory information this timing information and translates that into timed commands of our steps and hands and arms and so on? And then coordinates the muscles in this very sort of fine-grained manner that all of a sudden to us looks beautiful, okay? So that was sort of my initial entry into asking these questions. Well, and there's just for fun, I have one other activity up there, and that's the Rubik's Cube. Now, who of you can do this? Ha, very good, very good. This is a coordinative wonder. You guys are a wonder. Okay? What's your time? Anybody has a good time? Wait, how much? 42. 42. Who can do more? Better. 42. 34. 34. 34. 34. Who can do better? Okay. Well, regardless, I think that these are amazing feats. These are amazing feats when you start to think what you're actually doing with your hands and with your fingers. Not only do you hold the cube, you see how to rotate, parts of it, how to put pressure in a way that all 5 of your fingertips do this, then faster and faster, of course, okay? Not only correct, but fast, and then you turn and you look, and you do all of this in a coordinated way, okay? This is absolutely astonishing. And I'll give you a bit of numbers on that in a minute. Just to sort of become a little bit more pedestrian, while these activities are truly astonishing, once you start asking that question, how do we move the Rubik's Cube? Actually, it becomes just as much of a wondrous question is, how does that little child hold the fork and bring the spaghetti into her mouth? Or rather, not in the early days, okay? So how does she learn to hold the fork, find the mouth, and actually also performs all these coordinated movements with the facial musculature? And many others of these seemingly trivial activities, from carrying a cup of coffee and not spilling it while you're in the train or on the plane or somewhere else, right? Or playing ball of sorts, and down there you see a game of tetherball, which you'll see again a little later in the game, so to speak. Now, that this is all quite astonishing, it becomes very painfully visible when you start to see people in the street or in the hospital when they have some neurological disorders. And when you think of stroke, you've heard of stroke, I'm sure, where parts of the brain are damaged because of some blood clot, and suddenly, well, depends on the severity of that stroke, there is one side of the body is just no longer in control. And this is just heartbreaking, because not only is it heartbreaking because this person's life is destroyed, we as scientists don't know how to fix this. We do not know how the brain controls the movement such that we can develop interventions at any level, either with pharmacological substances, with behavioral therapy, or any surgery. We do not know how to restore function and re-establish what seems completely normal to all of us. So here are just some glimpses, and here is, this is again bad, here is a video showing a patient who has paralysis in her right hand, and the person is just asked to move the hand on the table, and you could see there was very, very little control. Now here, this shows some work of my collaborators who have developed some robotic devices which are like gym training machines to at least via behavioral interventions to give this person some training, and here you see more training, to give this person some training in the attempt or hope and justified hope. There is evidence that via such behavioral interventions we stimulate nerve regrowth and thereby nerve function, but so far in a very limited fashion. And this is really still groping in the dark. So let me give you some numbers to show you that big puzzle a little more. So the human anatomy is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. By the way, who of you have looked at Google Body? More, hands up, hands up. No? Oh, you gotta do that. Type in Google Body. You might have to download an upgrade of your browser, but that's peanuts. Look at that. You have the body, like you can see the muscles, the bones, the organs, the nerves, and you just put some sliders around and you can isolate whatever you want to isolate and zoom. So, when you do that, and I give you just a couple of very straightforward numbers. Numbers of bones and joints are 200, and each hand has 27 bones. All right? So when you do the Rubik Cube, you have 27 plus 27 is, good, 54, okay? So 54 of these bones are being moved around. That is 54 sort of objects of control. All right? But this is not everything. So the number of muscles is not one muscle per bone. That would then be 54 muscles. No, that would be way too easy. Let's say 2. That would be 108, okay? Well, that's not how it works. Once you look a little more into the anatomy, you can see that each joint has a whole number of muscles sort of in a, let's call it irregular fashion, spanning the joints. And each joint has more than one, mostly more than one degree of freedom. So again, just a number, the thumb has 9 muscles that are ultimately driving that single finger. A few less in the other digits because the thumb has this very special status. But there you go, right? 54 bones and then those 18 muscles just here, and you might start to add up and see the complexity, what you're doing all the time in controlling these muscles in your Rubik Cube game to do these actions continuously while you're sitting, standing, talking. The nervous system, just a few more numbers. Just to drive home the message how wonderful every one of us is as a human being. Number of nerve cells in the brain, 100 billion. Thank you very much. The number of synapses for a typical neuron are 1,000 to 10,000. So each of those neurons shakes hands with, say, a minimum of 1,000 others. And they're not necessarily, well, they are neighbors, but then they're long and sort of go through the brain, and we haven't figured out the connectivity in the brain and how these neurons, which are channels for information transmission within the brain and then into the periphery of the body, how that works. So it is just simply amazing and beyond comprehension at this point. By going into individual neurons and trying to understand their role in the information transmission. So, motor control, the area that I've gravitated into or slithered into, danced into, is how does the brain control coordinated movements, or just say the same thing in a slightly different way, how do we control our high-dimensional dynamical system? Now, I'm using a different language, which are already some technical terms, because when you start thinking about the body, well, yes, we have the nervous system, we have muscles and bones, as I just said, but the result of it is a mechanical or a dynamical system, a physical system, okay, with lots of linkages and lots of degrees of freedoms or dimensions, to use that more engineering physics term. And then what goes wrong in dysfunction? So how can we understand the functioning? So how can we even approach it? Because, well, the questions are absolutely driving us, right? Why can my boyfriend not dance with me? I mean, there is absolutely federal funding necessary for that, right? Or how can we help stroke patients, Parkinson patients, amputees, where we develop prosthesis for it. So we can look at its composition, the human body's composition, and the fine grained structure. We can look at its function with manipulations, and that latter suggestion is what I am doing in my lab. So that second part is what we call a systems approach, because we don't take the system apart, but we leave it as a whole, and then we look and subject it to different conditions, and then we see how it responds and draw our conclusions from it. So we do experiments. These are guided by some knowledge of what is within, which many other people, biologists, neurologists, do. And then we also have mathematical models about how that system is being controlled. And this is what we're testing. So for that, I think it sort of comes through already. Interdisciplinary work is required. Now, just to make this absolutely crystal clear one more time, neurophysiology is needed to understand the specific structure and functioning of the neurons. Biomechanics is needed because, well, basic anatomy and muscle mechanics. Experimental psychology is an area where they have for a century already asked how humans behave, and they have developed an experimental approach and design to run such research. Control theory, which is a branch of engineering, is to understand issues of control, how the brain controls the movement. Information theory, another branch, well, in sort of engineering, is to understand the processing and decision-making. Nonlinear dynamics is a more recent applied mathematics development which deals with highly complex and nonlinear systems, such as our body. And there's also robotics, because in robotics, some, not all of them, try to understand how to develop machines that are as agile, flexible, and skillful as biological systems, animals or humans. So robotics and motor control very often go hand in hand, because robotics tries to understand from human researchers how the human works or animals work, to then import the principles into robot control, and vice versa, it works as well, because we, myself, working with humans, we speculate, well, we think humans work that way, let's just build something along how we think and make a model and then see whether the behavior is the same. So there's a close connection between biological work and artificial systems. And all of that is motor control or motor neuroscience. So that as a big introduction to the field. So I thought now I'll give you a little snippet of a piece of research that I am doing to give you a bit more than the whole generalities, all right? And I'll keep it sort of simple, accessible. If I'm losing you, just sort of nod off, then I know, and I'll step back and try to be more interesting. So, skill acquisition is one of the things I'm interested in. Skill acquisition, well, how do we learn? How do we learn skills as the Rubik's Cube and dancing and all this and that, okay? So one very evident aspect in learning is variability. And again, to say the obvious, when you learn a task, and let me already home into a throwing task, which is what I will choose. Well, skill is pretty much defined by how accurate you can throw. A frisbee, you know, a softball, a dart, whatever, right? How accurate you can throw, release a projectile and hit a target. That's an acquired skill. We weren't quite born with it, okay? But so we can look at this just as a one example task to see how the variability that we have initially, which is a sign of lack of control, changes with practice towards more stable behaviors. So variability is a good window into understanding the control of behavior. So now, sort of strap down, it's getting a little more technical for a while. So variability is an indicator for skill performance. Variability decreases with learning, but it's never eliminated. That's, by the way, an interesting thing to keep in mind. Variability is never eliminated, as one might know, say, from Olympic athletes. Just think of an extreme skill in Olympics, such as pistol shooting, marksmanship. These guys practice forever, 8 to 10 hours a day, and they still have some variability left, right? Otherwise, they would all be Olympic champions, all of them, right? They would just be smack on all the time, but they're not. So some variability or noise in the system remains. But so how do we get from a lot of noise when you learn a skill such as, say, dart throwing, to very little noise, okay? Now, let me stress one more thing before we go there. Absence of variability is also a sign of dysfunction, and that is often labeled stereotypy. That is when there is repetitive behavior, very similar and unstoppable, and that is a sign of some pathologies. And I just went to a talk this afternoon on autism, and autistic children in severe cases have fits of very regular behavior. Yeah, flapping, body rocking, very regular behavior, which you might think they otherwise have some neurological dysfunctions, but it instantiates itself, it shows itself as very stereotypic behavior. So that's also not what we're after. And then just a sort of more philosophical point, variability is also pretty much the hallmark of biological systems. If you compare biological to robotic systems, well, biological systems, humans, animals, very quickly adapt if something that they didn't see before happens along the way. Whereas in, I would say, all robots so far, they're not very adaptable. They're programmed well as long as things are predictable. But as soon as something unpredictable comes along, well, machine runs into it. End of story. So adaptability is one of the big hallmarks of biological systems, and it is discussed that the variability that we have is a means towards this ever-changing and adaptable behavior. All right, now there we go. I said we go back to tetherball. Tetherball, or skittles, which is the English version of the American tetherball. And that is, you throw a ball which is suspended to a pole, around the pole, to hit a target somewhere on the other side, or a set of targets, as in skittles. Never mind, we'll keep it to one target. Okay? So here's just a little clip, a little golfing clip from a British environment. All right, so they do it like that, okay? And on the right, you can see a rendering which leads us to how we have now rendered this task into the lab. This is a side view, and now this turns into a top view. And now you see what our subjects are seeing when they are in the lab. They manipulate an arm, and then they release or open a hand at the right time, which releases a ball, and the ball then goes round the post to hit a target. And this is just showing that you can throw the ball in many different directions, left, right, of course, with different release angles and velocity. Okay? Now, the more physically minded amongst you, and probably all of you, it's general education, that the trajectory of the ball, the way the ball then flies in this virtual environment, which mimics real environment, is fully determined at the moment where it leaves the hand. So throwing is actually a very interesting task that a single moment determines then how the ball traverses the air and hits the target. Of course, assuming there's no wind and all this and that, okay? So the angle and velocity of release determines the trajectory and then the error from the target. Now there's some additional interesting thing there, and that's what's called redundancy as a technical term. And that is the following. So I can throw that ball with a given angle, and when I say angle, I mean angle here on that device, which I'll show you in a moment, and a velocity. But I think it's easy for you to imagine, say, if I throw it with a different angle but a higher velocity, I might be still as good, right? Think of it as darts, right? If I release the dart, say, at the top here, I need a given velocity to hit the target. If I release it a little earlier, I just need a different velocity, and then I still hit the target. So the point in more mathematical language is that it's a task that has redundancy with a manifold of an infinite number of solutions. I'll come back to that one later, one more time. So let me just show you here a brief glimpse. There's a model, because in order to create this virtual environment, you have to have a mathematical model of the task that you then program and that then generates the trajectories of the ball. Okay? So this is this model which mimics the tetherball or Skittles game that I showed you before. So there's sort of some math in the background. And this is how it looks in our lab. On the right, one of my former graduate students, and you see it schematically here on the left, rests his arm on this manipulandum, which just rotates around a vertical stanchion, and then you move, okay, like this. And what we measure is the rotation of the arm and the velocity by differentiating the position signal. And then we measure we simulate the release of the ball by having a switch on that ball here. Oh, it doesn't work. Having a switch on the ball, and when the hand is opened, that time releasing that switch corresponds to the program, or tells the program, now this position and velocity, take it, calculate the ball trajectory, and there we go. So now back to this idea of redundancy and manifold, which will be interesting, and bear with me here when we start to look at variability. So bear with me. So here you see once again top-down version of ball trajectories, okay? And you see that the red and the green ball trajectory, they both go through the target. They both would have what we call then zero error, while that dashed blue trajectory has some error, okay? Now, as we try to show here, those red and green trajectory actually have different release angles and velocities, but they both have the same equivalent result. Now, how do we sort of analyze this behavior? Well, we draw what we call an execution and result space, where we plot all the release angles, all possible release angles, and all possible release velocities here. And the color, the orange and especially the white, well, denotes the error. The error that is obtained when you release the ball, say with 80-degree angle coupled with a 600 degrees per second velocity. So each of those points corresponds to one of those trajectories, okay? And what is the interesting part that was behind why we chose this task is that it has redundancy in a very interesting fashion. So as long as you are on that white solution manifold, as we call it, you have a zero hit. And mathematically, there is an infinite number of ways to achieve the perfect result. The question is, how do you deal with it when you just perform that task? So here, just by example, is a bunch of probably about 60 trials where the subject starts, right, sort of scattered around, a typical starter, a typical novice behavior. So now think about it, and I'll ask you before I tell you the solution. Remember I said we look how we deal with variability with practice. So there is actually 3 different ways, what we name here, 3 different ways how you can become better whilst you still have some variability. Because like the marksman, we never lose variability. There's always inaccurate noise in our sensory motor system. So what would you think a subject could do? How could he or she change their behavior to become better? I'm listening. Yes?
Aim for the spot that has the widest margin for zero error.
Right. Aim, he says, what's your name?
Scott.
Scott? Scott just said aim for the spot or area which has the widest, well, margin for error, you said. Or I can say aim for that location on the solution manifold which has the shallowest curvature, all right? Because curvature, you can think of the color like a 3D picture, like a 3D surface. And where it's very shallow, there's a lot of space where you can vary around and still have very good error. That is, very good solutions. Okay? Very good. There is another way, and this is not exclusive. They all contribute to each other. Any other idea? We need Scott. There's one relatively trivial idea which you probably think about and don't dare to speak up, which is to just, well, shrink your variability. Just shrink it to have a slightly, smaller diameter in your scatter. So that's kind of trivial. But there's one other one which is not all that trivial. Think about it.
Would that be being able to adjust your speed if you have a different angle or a different angle, different speed?
Yeah, to sort of adjust the angle with the speed and vice versa. Co-vary angle and speed with each other. So let me graphically show you that. The 3 ways how you can become better in that task, how you deal with your variability. So let me first just sort of sketch. This is kind of a hand-drawn capturing. This is where the initial variability is. And mind you, sometimes subjects begin at a different location in that space, and when they practice, they start to discover that the same type of scatter up here gives them miserable result, whereas if they just move the same type of scatter here, they get good result. It's kind of a strategy. We call it sensitivity to error, tolerance. This is what you intuited, right? We call it tolerance or sensitivity to error. The next one is, well, reducing noise. Kind of trivial, but still worth mentioning. And the last one is, what's your name?
Julia.
Julia? Yeah, what Julia mentioned is co-varying your angle and velocity such that, well, if you throw a little later in your movement, you just lower your velocity or the other way around. So if you orient your data like this, you're still very variable, but you're varying along solutions which all give you fine error or fine result. All right, so now let's look at some data and see whether that buys us anything. So what you see here is some examples from an early practice, intermediate, and late. And as you can see, there is a large scatter which has a focus up here, and then the person moves, just as we said, to that wider, shallower area. Covariation sets in, and reducing noise and covariation is enhanced with later practice. Okay? This was examples from 15 days of practice, and I'll show you the results in a moment. The next slides I will probably skip because that is then more technical, namely, how do we assess and quantify these 3 routes to deal with your own variability? And maybe just very, very briefly. So we manipulate the data, we shift them around in this space, we find the optimal location, and then we calculate the average error for the initial actual data and the actual error for the optimally shifted data, and take the difference. And the difference gives us a measure in result error where we can say this is how much you could have been better without changing your variability, only moving it around. So you could be 2 centimeters better if you just did the same variability but in a different location. Very briefly here, we manipulate the data, we shrink them in steps, and we calculate how much error could you become better if you reduce the amplitude of your scatter. Again, we take the average error in the beginning and the average error of the best solution, take the difference, and that gives us a measure of how much better could you become if you had reduced the amplitude of your noise. And lastly, this covariation cost, we take the data, we shuffle them around, pair them in an optimal manner, so that we then again look at the mean error of your initial actual data, the mean error of your ideally co-varying data, and the difference gives us how much you could gain if you shuffle it properly. Okay? So, now just quickly an experiment. So how do we go about? Well, we take volunteers into our lab and we ask them to practice this throwing task. And in this particular experiment, we had 12 novices plus 3 experts, and those 3 experts were actually sort of intramural frisbee player, one was an Australian cricket player, no, South African cricket player, and another one was just crazy athlete. And so these 3 guys kind of actually competed with each other over 15 days of practice. And, well, they all wanted to become as good as possible. And so we wanted to see how they dealt with their variability over this very, very long practice. Then we had some kind of normal student population, 12 novices that practiced for 6 days. Each of the days, they did 3 times 60, that is 180 throws, so a total of 1,010, and many more for the experts. So, firstly, just let's have a look at the data. Let's have a look, did they actually learn something? Did they do what we wanted them to do, namely become better? So we look at their error over time. And yes, thank you very much, they became better, the error reduces, and what you see here is these blocks of practice, and we plot an average error for the entire group, I say average or novice group, and for the 3 experts altogether. And you can see what you always see in these learning experiments, that you have this kind of exponential approach towards some plateau where people just don't get better anymore. Okay? And when we look at standard deviation, same thing. So that's not surprising. It's great that it happens. So now we can sort of roll our sleeves up and do our variability analysis. So here is what you can see. We calculate these costs. And they are now plotted in different color. So there's this tolerance cost, which meant like finding the right strategy. There's the cost due to covariation, and the cost due to noise reduction. All right? This is the average novice group, and these are the individual 3 experts. So to begin with, you see a similar pattern in all of them. that is the same rank ordering. You also see that this blue line sort of bottoms out very quickly and very early, which means that initial finding the most shallow place in that execution space happens very early. The next, and I think more important finding, is the rank ordering between the noise cost and covariation cost. So noise, it has the largest cost, meaning there is still a lot that can be done, reduced, to get better. The covariation is kind of in the middle. Now, this is and has an important implication, or let me just phrase and say something about this result in different ways. When we started out with talking about variability, and yes, when you get better, you think you just, well, decrease your variability, right? So some random noise and fluctuations get eliminated and you get better. What we show here is that actually that reduction of the random noise is what is the least improved. What actually is much better improved are those two other contributions. This also shows that in the remaining part of your performance after many, many days of practice, that random component is still there and people have not managed to reduce it, whereas they have exploited these two other routes towards improvement. In short, we have shown that this sensory motor noise, here indicated by the green line, can be reduced, but not as much as other components. So this is sort of one result, and I have one other one, which is where we took this very same task and examined Parkinson patients. Because, well, this is all funny, not funny. It's fun, that's what it is. It's funny too sometimes. But, so this is fun, this is basic research, trying to sort of get a quantitative handle how subjects develop and modify their behavior with practice. But as I indicated at the outset, is yes, we would like to also understand patients with neurological deficits. So on the basis of what we have understood with healthy subjects, we now take this to also look at patient behavior, and then we can compare patient behavior with healthy subjects. So very, very briefly, we had 19 PD patients, and 19 PD is Parkinson's disease. Do you know what Parkinson's disease is? Yeah? Right? A lot is actually a disease which is growing fast with people getting older, and I don't know the exact numbers, but they're too high, that's what I can tell you. And it is a relatively well-known disease with its origin in lack of dopamine production in the basal ganglia, and it has numerous motor symptoms, from loss of balance, from tremor, from the inability to kind of initiate movements, and many more, many more. It's very, very sad. And again, we have it's actually one of the very few diseases where or not myself, others have developed a drug that can delay the progression, but not help. So we have our Parkinson patients, and I'll just show you a couple of slides. Here you can see again the error over block, and you can see how the errors in the red PD patients are considerably larger than in healthy age-matched controls. Not too surprising, evidence that yes, they have problems also in a task like this. And these were just so-called moderate patients. while still taking medication. But the most striking observation is the following, namely, this is the first day of practice, second day, third, fourth, and then 5 days of rest and coming in again. What you can see is that after 24 hours of rest, they start out considerably worse and then improve. And again, considerably worse, improve. Whereas the healthy elderly, they have a much better, call it memory or transfer from the day to the next day, and thereby improve. So there is something that they lose after stopping their session, something that they forget overnight. Now, if we plot our costs, we analyze the data in the same manner, and we now look how their noise, how their covariation, and their tolerance cost behaves, you see the following pattern. Let's begin actually with those two down here, where the green dots and the red dots don't do very much, nothing different. But here, the tolerance shows actually exactly that pattern that you saw before. So this is what is responsible for that initial decrement in behavior. It is the fact that they don't find the right strategy, which is due to the fact that in initial, this is too much for you right now. So they don't find the right strategy in the same manner as healthy subjects remain. Said in more positive terms, the noise level is actually not distinguished from healthy subjects. So this type of analysis gives us a somewhat more differentiated view, what is happening in learning as well as in healthy versus some patient populations. So let me finish with the serious part here and just show you a couple of faces, people that have actually done the work. I'm just talking about it. So these are people in my lab, my students, and collaborators. And maybe let me just mention one person here. This is Emily, who still is a biology student, honor student in the biology department, who has joined. And so occasionally I take on undergraduate students to join in, and I think she enjoyed it. That is the end of the official part, the serious part, and so you can wake up again. All right. So the next is, I thought I leave sort of 5 minutes for some questions, either to what I said, or we can also digress to my boyfriends, or things like that, or slightly questions like what Gail gave me, but I don't necessarily want to guide you in your questions. So let's just open up to just chatting. You have a, yeah.
Are the Parkinson's results what you had expected starting this? Because that seems like the opposite of what I would expect.
So what would you have expected? So the question from Scott is, are the results that we obtained in the Parkinson's patients what we had expected, or he conjectures actually something else? What would you expect?
Well, given that their symptoms are tremors and different, so tremors is variation in noise, basically.
Yeah.
I would have expected that would have been a major.
Yes. Yes. So what Scott suggests is very reasonable, given what we know of Parkinson's disease. For example, that tremor is a predominant symptom that these patients display. Wouldn't you expect that just everything is more variable? Actually, very reasonable, and not the case. And not the case. And actually, it goes together with some interesting observations in Parkinson patients. Don't know whether you have seen it. There is some videos out there, people who are hardly in control of posture, of balance, as well as arms shaking. You throw them a ball, and they just catch it. No tremor anymore. And there's some more recent, which is a little different. some more recent videos that just stir the communities, individual patients who again can hardly walk, have that slouching gait, and then they get on a bicycle and then off you go, you know. Just some amazing observations that make us wonder, you know, how is the system working? So how is their disease symptoms working? What is the origin? What is the origin, again, in more basic questions? The basal ganglia and the function of the basal ganglia is sort of at the core of their dysfunction. So what does the basal ganglia do in our system also as long as we're healthy? So these are stunning observations, and the results that I showed you were not as expected and kind of make us think, why? What is going on? And it's not, I can't give, you know, a smashing answer, I have the solution, but, you know, these observations sort of incrementally build up the picture of what is going on. Another question, another arm. Yes?
How did you end up at Northeastern?
How I ended up at Northeastern. Well, so going backwards, I came 2.5 years ago. I came from Penn State, which is a large school, a lot of football there. So it's a huge school. It has and had very good research there, and actually also had a very good group of people in motor control. But I was there for 13 years, and you know, you get to know your colleagues and you know exactly what they're going to say next. It's getting boring.
The noise level goes down.
The noise level goes down. Everything very good. Everything gets very predictable. You know exactly that, you know, I'm not going to be interested in what this guy is saying next. So let's change places. So that certainly, that was one major reason. Change is always good, you know? Change is good. And to be here is just pretty wonderful. There were some other considerations. But so how did I end here? Let's just rather go back. So before that, I was at the University of Connecticut in experimental psychology. And I was actually at Penn State, I was in the Department of Kinesiology and Integrative Biosciences. So as I said, you know, I started out with linguistics, and actually I did also a degree, part of my exams in poetry. So, and then I went to experimental psychology, to kinesiology, biosciences, all of here, and now, didn't I tell you that I'll end up in music? And I think you kind of got a why.
Dancing?
Dancing, that's right. I'll take all my motor control back to the music. But I'm kidding, I'm kidding. So going back, so yes, I did my PhD in Connecticut in experimental psychology. And actually, after I did my PhD, and I was kind of thinking, triggered by your question, what was one of my most sort of proud moments? So as I was sort of stumbling along in my German undergraduate career and always fascinated by movement, I suddenly ended up at UConn doing a degree in experimental psychology. Never thought I would do a degree in psychology. And so I was just following my nose, and then I had a PhD degree, and I applied like everybody else. And then I got the most stunning postdoc offers and a faculty position offer, which I eventually took. And in those days, already my postdoc at Penn, at the Center for Complex Systems. In Penn, it was in engineering, and then at Complex Systems, another psychology offer, and then I ended up in Penn State. And by that time, until that time, I was never thinking of going into academia. I just wanted to know how the body works. And so it was an eye-opener after my PhD that I had actually accomplished something, and people wanted to give me a job. And so, yeah, so then I suddenly had a job, which, yeah, I didn't expect. All right, other question. But I mean, okay, then let me give you the big message here is do what you like, because that you will do well. Don't plan rationally where to go. You know, follow your nose, do what excites you. And then you can work 12 hours, 14 hours a day, because that's exactly what you want to do. And then you get good, whether you want it or not. Do we have time for another question?
One more?
Hang on, you had a question, but if nobody else jumps in, you get it. Anybody contending a question from here?
How about the sides? The silent sides. Anybody want to jump in?
Sleepy sides, holding sides.
Or the back? Still with us up there?
All right, you have it.
How did you end up in 3 different departments?
How did I end up in 3 different departments? I mean, you saw a little bit, and this is just one part, one line of research that I'm doing. But as I was trying to sort of tell you along the way, to be interested in the human body, you can do that you need some physiological, mechanical, some control theory knowledge, and all of the pieces that I showed. And so we do some mathematical modeling, which I didn't play up much. So it really is the archetypal interdisciplinary work. And so as a result of this work and all the knowledge that is sort of necessary, Northeastern, has these wonderful interdisciplinary positions, and those 3 departments that I'm in truly reflect, the 3 major disciplines that I'm combining in this work. And yes, no, I didn't study, I didn't really go through a systematic study in each of those, nor did I have a PhD in those. But the kind of research reaches out and requires and can train students from these different departments. And my students that I just had up, now I have one graduate student in biology who pursues a PhD in biology. I have one graduate student in bioengineering, which is a PhD program. I have one graduate student in physics. My postdoc comes from biomechanics. As I said, I have one undergraduate in behavioral neuroscience and another undergraduate in mechanical engineering. And I can, by my affiliations, I can supervise them, and that has, I think, a very positive results, which my students also enjoy, namely, with their different training, they come together, we all have a big open space lab, and they can consult each other and do this interdisciplinary work relatively early on, while they still are in their departments and get their respective training. And I say Northeastern was great in offering me that multidisciplinary position, which is one big reason why I came here.
So we're running out of time, but I want you to hang on for 2 more minutes, because you can do this too, and you forgot to mention PRISM.
All right, so actually I see a couple of faces here. I am part of a program for undergraduate, mostly freshmen, 2nd year students, undeclared as well as declared, whoever wants to join. And what we call this is PRISM. It is an NSF, National Science Foundation, funded program to offer some novel, hands-on science experience. And we do that in a variety of ways. This spring semester, we offered a 1-credit course, which was actually a free credit, and a handful of faculty presents there. I did a 2-week module, and a Professor Karma in physics did a 2-week module, and other people do that. We have an upcoming module of a professor in biology, Steve Vollmer, who does 2 weeks, and so on. And so we just offer some glimpses with hands-on experiences during the spring course. In May, we are offering a so-called summer discovery program, where again NSF is pretty wonderful in that they provide stipends for the participants, I believe, of $1,000 and or, I forgot the details, you might know that, and housing for 1 month here on campus, and then you participate in, well, daily offerings, and it's 4 weeks, and 4 of us are responsible for 1 week each, and we do stuff. We do either, if it's run by a math professor, there will be some math problem, relatively creative problem-solving exercises. Don't know what Professor Carmen in physics does. I will guide students through some experiments, and they can design their experiments, collect data, analyze them, and to basically run through the motions. And I think also one mathematics professor will do 1 week. So this is going to happen. I think we just sent out the advertisements for sign up, and I assume that not everybody gets accepted, but first of all, we want everybody encouraged to apply who has the time, who is not scheduled. And then if you really can't get in, we will have offerings in summer, at the end of summer, rather at the beginning of the fall semester, and again in the fall, and then we go through the whole cycle again. So if you want some information, if you don't have it already, then ask me, or you can also search, I think, Prism Mathematics. It's on the math website. There is a section in the Department of Mathematics website where you can find a bit more information, as well as information how to sign up.
And I'll post that on Blackboard as well.
Okay, very good.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.